Episode 50, the co-founder and CEO of Blackstone, Steve Schwarzman. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Steve Schwarzman. Steve is the co-founder and CEO of Blackstone, one of the world's largest and most successful investment funds, with over $500 billion under management. Steve is also an active philanthropist with a history of supporting education, culture, and the arts. He holds a BA from Yale and an MBA from Harvard Business School. His new book is called What It Takes: Lessons in the Pursuit of Excellence. Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks a lot. Glad to be here.
Your ambition as an adult is, of course, self-evident. I'm curious, as a kid, was that fire in the belly evident back then?
Yeah, I think so. I always like to win things. It didn't much matter what they were. And when you're younger, it starts out pretty much from athletics. Can you be the fastest runner? Can you win a game? Can you hit the ball farther? I always was interested in that. Can you score more points in a basketball team? Can you get your team to win all the time? That's usually why you indulge in those types of activities. So you might as well win them.
Yeah, so I'm going to get real deep real quickly here. I'm no psychologist, but I'm always curious, what's behind someone's drive. I mean, sometimes it's parents that are very structured and disciplined. Sometimes there's just some sort of, internal compass. If you look back, what do you think it was that drove you to compete so much early on?
Well, it's always a combination of things. I've given a good deal of thought to this. One of the issues is that I never had parents who congratulated me on winning anything. It was just assumed that that's what would happen. And so maybe on a psychological level, if you never get the reinforcement from your parents, you keep looking for it by doing more and more. I also just like the feeling of excelling at things, mostly athletic things. It's just a marvelous feeling to be able to run faster than everyone who's trying to tag you. If you're at a summer camp and you're trying to capture the flag or something like that, and you can run away from everyone, it's actually pretty joyful. And I like that feeling. I like the feeling of shooting a ball in a basket and hearing the sound when it went in, and doing that as often as possible. It's sort of what B.F. Skinner would say psychologically is reinforcing.
So if the 15-year-old Steve Schwarzman, even rewind the tape further, the 12-year-old Steve Schwarzman, if he could peek into the future and see the current Steve, running the largest private equity fund in the world, would he be like, yeah, that makes sense. This is how I sort of envision my future? Or do you think it'd be more like, how the heck did this happen?
Well, it'd be a combination of all those things, because a 12-year-old one or a 15-year-old person has no idea that the world that I inhabit even existed at that time. So that was not an aspirational goal, because you can't aspire to something you can't even imagine. And, in the kind of neighborhood that, I was raised in, you didn't have those kind of visualizations. So it really is, as you get older, you learn more. I think a big breakthrough for me is when I went to college. I went to Yale. And
actually, I want to ask you something about Yale specifically, because this is probably one of my favorite stories in the book. So, Steve, you had set your sights on joining one of these social clubs, and it's somewhat based on popularity, so you had to come up with some scheme to raise your visibility on campus. So you hatched this pretty ingenious plan to capture everyone's attention. I want you to share that story.
I went to a college that was all men. somewhere between the age of 18 and 22, you get interested in women if you hadn't been before. So I figured that if I could, sort of develop some things that, were instructive, but also played on that other instinct, that would certainly raise your profile. So I started a series of things in the ballet area to recruit girls from the girls' schools, the women's colleges at that time, the Seven Sisters, to come to my university, Yale, to put on performances. And that ended up being pretty successful. I contacted the heads of the dance programs at the Seven Sisters, and 5 of them said they'd love to come to Yale and do a dance festival. And I got the top dance critic from New York to come up to review the dance festival. And I knew this would sell out because you had culture, refinement, and also, sort of almost a dating element of the thing.
So in other words, all this to not just bring culture to the school, but frankly, to bring women, to an all-male school. And suddenly you're the man on campus.
Well, that was a pretty easy success.
So let's get to life beyond college. You wanted to get into investment banking. I don't think you knew all that much about investment banking.
That's for sure.
So you had this job offer with a prominent bank. I think it was DLJ, if I remember.
Yes.
And it was for $10,000, which I guess was the going rate back then. But you gave them somewhat of an ultimatum that you needed another $500. That $10,500 was your price. And the reason being is that you wanted to be the highest paid person coming out of Yale. You had heard someone else at Yale already had a $10,000 offer, so you wanted to up them. So were you honestly prepared to walk away from that offer if you didn't get it, or were you just using that as a bargaining chip?
No, that's what I said. And, I was pretty unsophisticated, frankly, about how the world worked. I didn't even know what a stock was, and I was going to a securities firm. So that gives you my level of sophistication. But I knew I wanted to differentiate myself for no purpose other than for myself. It didn't make a difference to anyone else. And I never told anybody, what I was earning. It was really, I wanted this satisfaction.
But why was that important?
It's sort of like winning a race. Why is it important? You can always be in second place. You can be in fourth place. Just depends, what your psychological needs are. I realize this sounds a little crazy, this whole discussion, because as an adult, I would look at it as pretty unbalanced. On the other hand, I wanted to have that distinction. And yeah, I would have walked. And you don't say things that you don't mean. And so, I was dealing with a very nice person who realized that he was probably dealing with someone who was younger and somewhat unbalanced, and he was trying to be nice. And so he gave me the extra $500.
So, Steve, you started your Wall Street career. Again, not much of a finance or economics background, but it, of course, didn't deter you. So here's a quote from the book. "What I lacked in basic economics, I made up for with my ability to see patterns and develop new solutions and paradigms, and with the sheer will to turn my ideas into reality." So I guess, was your edge more about pattern recognition, or was it just pure hustle?
Well, no, you have to have some ability to see things. And as you were reciting what you just read, I was thinking about the first time I went to a company. It was a company called National Student Marketing. I didn't know much about the company except I was selected to go there because that company sold products to students. So I read some information about it. They were trying to sell life insurance to students, which I thought was pretty stupid because students who are in their teens or early 20s don't think they're going to die. So why would they ever buy life insurance on their own lives? It seemed nonsense to me. They also rented little refrigerators to students, And if you've ever gone to college and you see what happens with those little refrigerators, usually, they get destroyed in 2 or 3 years. And if I remember right, they were depreciating them over 5. And they had a number of other products that seemed to make no sense. And I went to visit the company, and after visiting it, it still didn't make any sense. It had nothing to do with numbers. And I remember meeting with one executive. I asked him who was in the next office, and he didn't know the name of the person who was right next to him. And I concluded that this company was going to go bankrupt. And I never saw a number on the company because the whole thing was nonsense, and it was public and highly valued, and it did go bankrupt.
Would you call it a heightened sense of intuition you have?
It's not intuition. What was I intuiting? I mean, there it was. This was all absurd. So what I tend to be able to do is just see something and understand what that situation is really describing, as opposed to what somebody might tell me about it.
Well, you had highlighted this one nail biter of a deal to sell Tropicana. So you were asked to go down to their headquarters immediately and advise them on this pending acquisition. And you had like an hour to figure things out. And I don't think you even had much M&A experience at the time.
I would say none.
So you had no M&A experience. I mean, Steve, you're in way over your head. So what happened? How do you get this deal done?
Well, the first thing you do is recognize you're totally over your head, and you call somebody who you hope knows something. So I called the head of the firm, at 7:30 in the morning, and he wasn't particularly experienced in mergers and acquisitions. So he told me to call the number 2 person at the firm who was, and I woke him up and I described the circumstances, and he gave me some guidance, and he said, you can get better judgment from the number 3 person at the firm. So I woke him up, and he gave me some more guidance. So at least I knew vaguely what I should be doing. And I then had to go to a board meeting because I called from Tropicana down in Florida to New York, where all these other people were. And I had never been to a board meeting. So I didn't even know what it looked like. And I sort of walked in the room, and the control shareholder was there, Mr. Rossi from Sicily. And he sort of looked like a character from The Godfather. And, he said, sit right here. And I sat at the end of the table. And, there were about 7 people in the room. It's a small board, evidently. One of whom was the former governor of Florida. I had never met a governor of anything, let alone governor of Florida, and some other distinguished people. And they asked me what I thought about this proposal. And there was a lady sitting to my right. I didn't know her job until she started taking notes. She was a stenographer. And it did sort of get my attention that they had 2 tape recorders on the table, and they turned them both on when I started talking. So I realized this was like really serious business, and I could get into a lot of trouble.
Were you nervous? Were you sort of sweating buckets here? I mean, that's a pretty big deal. You're in a boardroom. You're by yourself. No one else is there. Were you sort of panicked?
You can't allow yourself to panic because that kills your effectiveness in your role. And so I remember sitting at the end of the table and saying, okay, I don't know much, but I probably know more than these people do. So I should start out describing the whole situation, what the flexibility is of the board to make certain types of decisions, that they don't have to do anything. It's not necessary if they don't like what's going on. And then I described the price and what it looked like, and that it seemed fair to me, and that there were 3 different proposals that the buyer had made of how they would pay for it. And I took the board through each of those proposals in terms of, what the advantages and disadvantages were. And I encouraged a discussion among the participants of what they saw.
But Steve, let's back up again. You had you had no M&A experience. I mean, here you are representing this investment bank on a major acquisition, and other than just having a quick pep talk with some of your colleagues, you're doing this all by yourself as if you've done this 100 times before. Look, there are a lot of people, probably most people, I think, in the world that were they called upon to go represent a company in an area they'd never done before, they would have said, I need backup. They might have said, hey, let someone else do it. I've never done this before. And you sort of said, hey, it's my moment. I'll go do it, even though you're completely sort of working off your gut instincts and a little bit of advice ahead of time.
Yeah, well, I was a fifth year associate, so I know how securities work. I'd just never done a merger. And I could figure out what the advantages and disadvantages would be. And part of it is understanding what somebody else is thinking. And that leads you to the right answer. This was the second biggest transaction in the world that year. And so if you really want to be scared, that would scare you. But it's sort of like game day, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can do prep or not do prep. But when you're on the field and somebody gives you the ball, you don't have a discussion about it. You run with it or you throw the ball. I had a lot of basic knowledge of corporate finance. I was trained in that. I just never done a merger. So I did have 2 conversations with the top 2 of the 3 people in the firm. And, they gave me some confidence in certain things. And they didn't tell me which way to go on some of it. They said it's a matter of taste. So I said, okay. So I got 2 of the 3 things that are probably better. And you just explain it to people and say, well, which kind of risk would you be comfortable taking? And if you learn what people are thinking that you're working with, you can use logic to get yourself to the end of it. I must say, after a whole day of doing this and getting back to New York at like 4 a.m, I sat down in a chair and put a fire in the fireplace, and I got a brandy snifter, and I don't even drink, and I put Saturday Night Fever on, and I just sat there and I went, what the hell did I just do? And, so the enormity of being alone and the type of things you were asking me about sort of flooded in, but in the moment, you just perform.
By the way, fantastic album. And later I'll explain to the millennials listening who the heck the Bee Gees are. But it's an amazing story. So let's fast forward to Blackstone. You start the company with the former CEO of Lehman, someone that you were very tight with. The 2 of you went out, rented some office space, sent a ton of letters to contacts you had, hundreds, maybe thousands of contacts, even took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, and then sat back and waited for business to come your way. And waited some more. Steve, the phones weren't exactly ringing off the hooks. So 1 minute, you're this M&A king of Wall Street, and the next minute, you're essentially begging for business. I'm guessing it must have been a trying time for you emotionally. Did you ever second guess yourself? Did you ever think maybe it's not in the cards, I should go back and find another job with another firm? What was going through your mind?
Well, I would say it was crushing, and it was scary. And of course you think you might have made a mistake. I just missed the point that there was no other business of the type that we were starting. Right now, in 2019, there are lots of M&A boutique advisors, some of which have become quite large and successful. But when we started, there were none. And I confuse the fact that people, who run large companies used to hire my partner and myself all the time, to do large projects. We just thought if you changed the name, it wouldn't make any difference because they were working with 2 people. Apparently, I didn't get the joke that these large companies were scared to use a quote, untried organization, although there was no organization. It was just the 2 of us, and they used us before. I couldn't understand why they wouldn't do it, which was one reason we went forward and started the company. only to find out that the only people who agreed with us were the two of us. And that was just really, nothing's worse than sitting in a almost deserted office, watching your startup capital disappearing every day as the rent's being paid, the Xerox machines were working, the phones were being rented, and so was the furniture. And you just see your initial capital money just disappearing. It was really, I can't even describe the sense of despair and idiocy that I credited myself with. Where did I get this wrong? I said to my partner, what do we do? He was 21 years older than me. He said, well, we wait 3 weeks and we call everybody again. And eventually somebody gave us a piece of business, and that started us off.
Yeah. And then, of course, that turned into more business, and you built up a very nice advisory business, which then you used to launch your first fund. This is a fund to essentially those that aren't familiar with the buyout business. You're buying companies, adding value to them, eventually selling them or taking them public. First of all, it's crazy that the first fund you were trying to raise was $1 billion, which in itself was probably 10 times the size. I mean, Steve, maybe this is the modern day equivalent of the extra 500 from Yale, right? Which is, well, why do 100 million if I can do $1 billion? But that's what you and your partner set out to do. And it, again, was very challenging. You got way more no's, of course, than yeses. But then you finally got all of those commitments delivered. That first fund close the morning of October 19th, 1987, otherwise known as Black Monday. The biggest one-day drop in the stock market ever, I believe, to this day. I mean, just literally one day later, Steve, and there's no fun. You're out of luck. It's crazy sometimes, I think, to think about the threads of serendipity that can, in an instant, alter the course of our lives. Do you ever wonder what would have happened had you not closed that morning?
Well, I didn't have to think about it very long. I knew what would have happened. Things would have collapsed, and all of our efforts would have most probably been wasted. It's funny that I get sometimes a sense of when the world's getting really crazy. You would call it, if you were more technical, overvalued, or whether there's too much risk or too much credit extension. There are a lot of fancier words to say it, but it becomes a fearful time for me. And I can now, as a grown-up, articulate why I feel that way. But, I knew we just had to close this fund. I didn't even know why. And I had a very nice person working for me. Because I had nothing else to do, I kept walking into her office, probably 25 times a day as we were trying to get all the legal documents done. And I'm sure I was exceptionally annoying, but, I just wanted things done. Was there anything I could do to help? As it worked out, we just kept pushing and pushing, and we had our official closing on Thursday, and some people didn't get their legal papers in until Friday. And then the world just sort of blew apart on Monday. And, I was so annoying that this individual I was working with quit afterwards and became a psychotherapist. And I don't know how I have, sort of these pretty strong feelings when things are overblown in the environment. And it forces me to get certain types of things done. And that was one of them. And I've never run the scenario of what happened if we had missed, because it didn't happen. I knew we would have gotten sort of delayed for closing, or maybe never. And, we would have just missed the moment.
So there's this remarkably strong, conviction and resilience in you. And so at one point, it might have been that first fund, it might have been the second fund, but it was after this day of just worthless fundraising meetings. And you were trying to boost the morale, I believe, of your co-founder. This is a quote of yours. To be successful, you have to put yourself in situations and places you have no right being in. You shake your head and learn from your own stupidity. But through sheer will, you wear the world down and it gives you what you want. So is this about faith in some way? Like, someone sort of watching out for you? Because, let's be honest, it's not like the world always rewards hard work and perseverance.
Well, I think it's pretty simple that if you have a perception of something that is possible to do, that you think the world wants and you think is a great thing, and those kinds of thoughts and conclusions don't happen very often. This is not every week you feel this way. It happens every few years with something, and you've thought it through, and you know that there is huge demand, or there should be, for what you want to be doing. Just because people reject that doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're either talking to the wrong group of people who don't have that interest, or you haven't described what you're doing the right way. But if the vision, which I call, like a worthy fantasy, has been thought through and is real, you just never give up. Because if you know that that's real and it's great, then eventually the world will discover what you're doing is worthy, and it'll succeed. And actually, I was in a pool in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, and with the person who was my sort of head fundraiser, and we had spent 6 days in Saudi Arabia, 6 presentations a day, and we didn't get one person interested. And so, it was about 120 degrees, and we were floating in this pool. And I described as a person named Ken Whitney, who, helped us, in the early stages of the firm. And I saw him a few weeks ago after the book came out, and he said, "Steve, you should have sent me a copy of the book. I would have added that I thought you were completely nuts."
And there's always got to be a little bit of a few screws loose to be an entrepreneur, because it is so risky. But obviously you ended up not just raising money, but doing a lot of deals and making a lot of money for your investors. But then there was this one particular deal you did, Edgecombe, and it went south pretty quickly. So you used that experience to re-architect the entire investment process at Blackstone with an eye toward mitigating risk, so that kind of scenario would never happen again. So walk me through, what was the process that you changed, and how would you make it so you could almost, bulletproof this investment process?
We started out with myself in charge. I was completely inexperienced making investments, so it's almost like a rerun of the M&A story at Tropicana, except this was much more serious because it was the money we raised from large institutions. And I'd never invested in anything before, and this was our third investment. And we had no process. Somebody at the firm knew a company that would sell itself to us. It was in the steel distribution business. And one of the other partners heard that we were looking at it. So the first partner had come to me and said, "This is a great thing." The second one came and said, "This is the stupidest deal I ever heard of. It's nothing but inventory profits because steel was going up." So it looked like the company was making a lot of money. But he said, when steel prices go down, this company's going to hemorrhage and we're going to go bankrupt. So I brought both of these people to sit in front of my desk, making pretend I was King Solomon. And I listened to both, had them argue it out. And with my normal great judgment, I picked the wrong person. And we bought the company, and 3 months later, we couldn't pay our principal or interest. And it was a horrible experience, and it was all my fault. 100%. Forget the person who recommended it. He was wrong, but it didn't matter. I said yes. And so I realized that people lining up in front of my desk was a bad idea. I apparently was not a genius.
Because whoever has the best pitch essentially wins.
Right. So we can't do that because people in finance are good at pitching. They're like people in Hollywood. They're good at pitching. And so apparently I wasn't as good at catching as they were at pitching. And so I realized I had to diversify decision-making away from me. And we couldn't be rushed into any decision. And we needed lots of written information that we could absorb. And we needed a list of those risks. And we needed a group of people who could debate the risks in any proposal to make sure we never lose money. Because I realized that if you lose money, people don't like you. And if they don't like you, they'll take their money away, or they'll never give you new money. And if you fail enough, no one will ever support you, and your enterprise will collapse. So this was an existential threat to what we were doing, and I was the risk. So by having the kind of procedure I'm talking about, and making sure that there wasn't one great person, man or woman, making the decision and interrogating the team that brought the transaction, that everybody who sits at a table has to talk, and they have to interrogate and discuss the risks in that proposal, and that we don't have paid audiences that come to meetings. Most investment committees have paid audiences. In other words, the people who attend, they're paid, and they do nothing. They sit there and watch somebody interrogate.
So you want everyone's voice to be heard in this meeting. And once all the voices are heard and everyone's laid out their thoughts, ultimately, is there a committee that then decides and it's, just a number of votes?
No. The way it works is usually what happens after that meeting is you learn we didn't know everything we needed to make that decision. So you have a list of further questions, and the team goes away, answers those in writing, and you do that procedure again. And if you do that 2 or 3 times, then the answers become quite obvious.
So you eventually get everyone aligned. It's not like you have some dissenters and you go off majority.
No, because no one should be a dissenter, because it's really just an intellectual debate.
So on this note, with not losing money, you have these golden rules, corporate, personal values that you live by. And one of them, Steve, is to embrace failure, to learn from our mistakes. And then the other is to never lose money. So, I was reading these and trying to reconcile the two because they seem almost contradictory, right? It's like, it's good to fail, not on my dime. So how do you make sense of those?
Well, you try never to fail. On the other hand, you need to do things. So what you're trying to do is just reduce the risk in any situation to the point that there's no reasonable probability you'll ever lose money. And once you make that decision, you can look at the upside of an investment. Usually whenever any group brings a potential project, there's always an upside or else you wouldn't come. I tend to always look at that second. And if you can engineer out the risk, or at least know what the probability of underperformance is as a result of each of 2 or 3 variables, what you find is that sometimes your investment underperforms. And usually, about 80 to 90%, it's one of those 2 or 3 variables, which means that as a group, we failed to accurately figure out the probability that it would happen, the bad thing, and the magnitude of damage to us. And so that was an intellectual mistake. And so revisiting that and figuring out why that happened so that we can be better the next time is really important. One of the fascinating things, there are 2 other books that have come out recently in the investment area. One was written by Ray Dalio, who's the biggest hedge fund in the world, and one was about Jim Simons, who was perhaps the most successful portfolio investor. Basically, he was a mathematician and didn't know anything about securities, and he had a 39% compound rate of return over his career. Both of these individuals, who are friends of mine and myself, all have something in common, which is that we almost wiped ourselves out when we were early in our career. We made some horrible mistakes, and we were all resilient enough to look at what we did and said, oh my goodness, I've got to change that, and I've got to do something much, much different. each of the three of us adapted something different as a function of the kind of area that we were in. But I think that if we hadn't had these terrible setbacks when we were younger and in charge, we weren't participants. We were in charge of these sort of fledgling organizations that were doing well until they didn't. That need to reinvent, to objectively look at why we were failing and have a completely different decision-making paradigm is what's created these three fantastic outcomes.
Well, there's a lot of ingredients for all of your successful investing, of course. I think one of the ones that you point out is your ability to attract superstar talent. You say to only hire 10s. So beyond intelligence, I would assume, and a strong work ethic, and perhaps some domain expertise, what else do you look for? How do you find a 10?
Well, you sort of know them when you see them. They tend to have a terrific record of whatever they were doing before. They have this sort of blazing intelligence when they look at you. They're calm as people. They are articulate and can describe exactly why they make decisions. They have enormous energy. They can see the future. They can get worried about things that have barely started to happen. And they have that ability, like Wayne Gretzky in hockey, when he asked how he became the highest scorer in the National Hockey League, he said, "It's easy. I just skate to where the puck is going to be." And some people have that wonderful sixth sense to know where to take an organization.
And you get all this from sitting down with someone, or is it a lot of referencing to understand? Because like you said, these people are good pitch people. And so they can probably pitch themselves pretty well. So is it just a sixth sense you get?
Well, first you do, sort of due diligence to find out, whether they actually did stuff. But I find that people are almost completely transparent. You can feel how smart they are. You can sense their attitude towards operating under stress. Because if you're with somebody in an interview situation, many times people view that as stressful. I never do. I view it as like an adventure and fun. But if somebody's really stressed out about it, and you can see that, then they're the wrong person to be in the kind of position where you would put somebody who's a 10. So I often feel that these types of interview situations are really just transparent. People mostly give themselves away with their eyes, and the eyes are the window to the soul. And if you just look at people and listen to them and see how excited they are, how their mind works, how flexible their mind is, how curious they are about things, what their manner is, if you spend a little bit of time with them, they pretty much give themselves away.
I guess acquiring the talent is maybe half the battle. And when you've got a competitive industry like Wall Street, keeping them in their seats is maybe even more than half the battle. But clearly you've done an amazing job of retaining some exceptional people. So how about that part of the equation?
Well, it was interesting. I had the head of one of the most successful large firms in the world ask me the same question. He said, "Why do these people all stay? They could each be running their own giant business." And I say it's because we're like all in this together. It's fascinating. We're trying to be the best in the world. We're trying to share what we all do. We treat everyone equally at the firm, whether they're the people running operations or further down the organization. Everybody is treated as if they're as important as anyone else. And the reason is they are, in my view. There's no difference between a younger person and an older person except age, not capability. So when you have an organization where everybody feels it's a meritocracy, where you don't have internal politics, where you're always inventing new things. I happen to be in an industry that has no patent protection. So you invent something, and the next day, everyone you know can copy it. And so we're in a fascinating business where, intellectually, you have to be always inventing new things. And if you have a congenial group of people who's under that level of ongoing stress, but mastering it, it's actually a lot of fun. And so you would miss that type of interaction. It's like playing on a great team. Would you go to a really terrible team because you'd be the only good player? Isn't it better to be with great players? Isn't it better being Golden State and, winning NBA championships all the time? Or would you rather be a great player on a crappy team?
Steve, you've had some major health scares over the years. 2 near fatal car accidents, tuberculosis, a condition which is inflammation of your veins, which I believe took your grandfather's life, 95% blocked artery in your heart. But you mention all of these almost as an afterthought in the book, as opposed to life-altering events. So did these near-death situations not have a profound effect on your perspective in life, your values, your priorities?
Well, I think it affects you, but, fortunately, they all turned out well. And I think what it does is it makes you in touch with the fact that you won't be here forever. Most people forget that. And that creates a certain immediacy in your life because you want it to happen for yourself every day and for everyone you're with. It didn't change my life in any way. I guess theoretically you could have retreated from the world of affairs and worried about your own mortality for 40 or 50 years. I didn't look at it that way, and I have a lot of interests. But what it does do is it lets you know that you won't be here, and one day all of us will go to some doctor who will have a meeting with you that says, "I'm very sorry," and that day is going to come for everybody. It'll come for me, and I don't want to feel that I've been drifting. I like being self-actualized. I like doing things. I like creating things. I like helping people. And the fact that I've had some health issues, they're resolved and I'm in great shape, and let's go forward until I can't.
There are some people, of course, with your kind of success that at some point finally decided to end that chapter. Some got into politics, of course. You have Bill Gates, who went full time into his own foundation. Have you ever flirted with that idea? I know you're very magnanimous and do a lot of things to invest your money in good causes, but in terms of just as a full-time endeavor, ever crossed your mind?
I'm more into the add-on than eliminate type of approach. So I love Blackstone. I love the firm. It's fascinating. It's one of the world's greatest learning platforms you can ever have. We operate globally. We do all kinds of new things, and it's fascinating. To stop that would almost be like, withdrawing from daily stimulus. But by the same token, doing new things is fun too, as you sort of premised. And so I do political things. I help our government try and do some of the trade agreements that they're involved with, and that's quite interesting. And I do other things politically. So some might say you could do that almost full time. I do a lot of things in the not-for-profit area, and I start, sort of major organizations, and I find that fascinating too. So my problem is, as I'm getting older, I just keep getting busier and busier and busier. And I sleep less and less. And each thing I do is astonishingly exciting and important for society.
You say that most of the economic financial pundits out there
who suggest that it's impossible to predict a recession are wrong, that you actually can know where we are in the market cycle. So, that being the case, where are we?
Well, we're sort of creeping along. Every year it appears that some group of experts have declared we're having a recession. That's proven to be untrue. But that doesn't stop people from saying it. And where we are now is, if you just take the United States, for example, our growth rates have slowed a bit, probably around 2%. But we have some very unusual things happening. We have unemployment, down so low, we're sort of running out of workers. And what happens when that occurs is that people's compensation goes up, just supply and demand for people. And 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer-driven. And what's happening now is that workers are being paid more than inflation. In other words, for the first time in a very long time, lower income people are doing better. Now, what happens when the bottom 50% starts to get paid more is they spend that money. They don't put it into savings because they need things, because they haven't done as well in the past. And that spending continues to fuel the economic growth.
So you're not concerned?
No, and one reason for that is, we don't have a lot of this enormous excess that we had in that 2006, 2007 area.
By the way, I love the name of the book because you've got excellence in it. This podcast, The Art of Excellence. So how do you define the word, Steve? What's excellence mean to you?
Excellence is being the best that you can be at whatever you choose to do.
Perfect.
Well, it's great to be with you.
Oh, you're kidding? This was fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's my pleasure.
Hey, thanks for listening. Okay, don't go yet, please. 2 favors. I ask simply 2 favors. One, if you could please download the iTunes app. You could do it on your phone. You could do it on the computer. Take 60 seconds and leave a review. It means a lot. 2, you can find my episodes on several social media sites, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Find the one that you like the most. Find the one where you tend to have a lot of friends and followers. And if you could please either share it in the case of Facebook and LinkedIn, or retweet it on Twitter, that would mean the world to me. So those are the 2 asks I have. I love putting together this podcast. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Thank you so much, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.